speak to Tony Leon, who served as leader of the opposition Democratic Alliance from 1999 to 2007. He was also Prince Buthelezi's fellow member of parliament. Good to have you on the program despite the circumstances, Mr. Leon. You've had a long and distinguished political career in which you've interacted with Mangosuthu Buthelezi. Could you share some of your personal anecdotes or memories that highlight his character, also his contributions as a political leader?
Well, his contribution to South Africa is enormous. It's also obviously very contested and controversial, as some of the obituaries have reflected, because he was not cut from the same timber as many other people in the struggle. He had a different way of confronting apartheid, as is known. He participated in the Bantustan system, but very much as a figure of opposition to the National Party administration of the time. And then when change came to South Africa in 1990, he was very much the third man, in the sense you had Mandela and de Klerk at opposite ends, but as the chief partners in the negotiation. And then there was Mangosuthu Buthelezi and Inkatha Freedom Party, who in a way straddled both sides, because on the one hand, he'd been a very staunch opponent of apartheid, but he'd participated in what was broadly called the apartheid system of Bantustans. On the other hand, you had Mandela and the ANC, and Buthelezi, of course, had a foot in that camp as well, because he started off life in the ANC, and there was an enormous contestation, particularly in the then province of Natal, between Inkatha forces and ANC forces. And, you know, tens of thousands of people were killed in the bloodletting and the violence which spilt onto the Witwatersrand townships.
Yeah.
And front and center of that, of course, was the issue of Inkatha and the ANC relationship, which was extremely contested and fraught. And so a lot of the constitutional negotiations in which I was involved between 1991 and 1996 were very much centered on the position of Inkatha. And Chief Buthelezi chose to withdraw Inkatha and his KwaZulu-Natal government from the constitutional negotiations. So they happened without their presence and participation, which I always thought was a pity. And then when the elections were held in 1994, which Prince Buthelezi entered at the very last moment, of course, the IFP won a majority in KwaZulu-Natal, and so formed the government there, and simultaneously under our constitutional arrangements, Prince Buthelezi entered the cabinet. But he was very uneasy in that cabinet, and in a way our relationship started because I was the leader of an opposition party, then the Democratic Party, and though he was in government, there were continuous points of conflict and confrontation between him and President Mandela and the majority of the cabinet, which I think Buthelezi found very frustrating, but in a way he managed to straddle both being an opposition leader and also a government insider. And sometimes the tensions spilt out into Parliament, into the public sphere, especially issues like the TRC, of which Buthelezi and Inkatha were extremely critical, and vice versa, I have to say. And so there was this ongoing tension, and yet at the same time, President Mandela and afterwards President Mbeki chose, even after the constitutional requirement of having Inkatha in government had ended, to keep Mangosuthu Buthelezi in the cabinet. But this arrangement, this cooperation didn't last, and by 2004, 2003 in fact, the tensions between the ANC and Inkatha, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, had gone to boiling point. And at that point, Prince Buthelezi, through one of his emissaries, Mario Ambrosini, approached me and said, well, look, can we not collaborate and form an opposition pact? And we agreed to form something called the Coalition for Change, and we campaigned together as separate but cooperating parties in the 2004 election under that coalition banner. Now, of course, as history records, the ANC did very well in that election, and although the DA maintained itself as opposition, as the major opposition party, overall the coalition didn't work. And it's quite interesting that 19 years later, here we are, the seeds of that coalition have spilt over now to what is called, I think, the multi-party Moonshot Pact. Yeah. And you have its resurrection happening right now. So you can either say, well, that was a heroic failure, or the harbinger of something that was perhaps a little ahead of its time. But obviously in all that, Buthelezi and I had a very close working relationship. We got on very well. He was a formidable person. He was very much concerned about issues, I think, of personal dignity and his place in history. I think that did weigh very heavily upon him. But he was not afraid to speak his mind, and he stood up for some very unpopular causes, whether it was the free enterprise system, federalism as the best way of arranging the constitutional for South Africa, which didn't really succeed in the constitution itself, and more particularly because he didn't subscribe to the notion that there was only one party of liberation. He saw, and this I think was very much contested by the ANC, that Inkatha itself was one of the liberating parties in South Africa. Now, of course, a lot of ANC people, perhaps not today, as a mark of respect on his death, contested that vigorously and said basically Buthelezi and the IFP were handmaidens of the apartheid system. And so that was a running saw, if you like, right through the very long and largely distinguished public career of Mangosuthu Buthelezi.
So you say Mangosuthu Buthelezi played a significant role in South African politics, but I'm sure you'd agree with me that he had a unique blend of roles, from being a Zulu prince to also being a political leader. How did he balance these roles, and how do they shape, or rather, how did this shape his approach to leadership and politics as well?
Well, I think that's it. There were a lot of contradictions in the public profile and personality and political projection of Mangosuthu Buthelezi, in the sense that he was a staunch traditionalist, and I think you've seen that because this went right through to his last year on earth, when his deep involvement in the Zulu king's succession, which has been controversial, and he was front and center of that. You had that on the one hand. On the other hand, he was, a politician who was very much involved in the modern work of Parliament and the cabinet and so on. And he shuttled between those two roles. Now, sometimes the one tended to overwhelm the other. Sometimes they were in balance. And I think trying to figure that out was part of a legacy, a very long legacy, which is going to be very complex and even controversial, because can you, in fact, straddle all those worlds? I think he certainly tried to, and perhaps he succeeded where others might not have, because if you take as the departure point in Slanka the other leaders who were involved in the same system that Buthelezi was at the time, the Homeland System, the leaders of Transkei, maybe Bantu Holomisa is one of them who did, but he does so from an ever-diminishing base. The others have either died or ended their political careers not well remembered, or even remembered at all. And here you have, on the day of the death of Mangosuthu Buthelezi, an appropriate outpouring, positive, sometimes negative, about his life and his legacy, which I think does tell you that he was appropriately, as we say at the beginning of the Rugby World Cup, a very high-impact player, whether you agreed with him or not.
So critics often describe Prince Buthelezi in varying terms, including being a warlord or even being a visionary. How would you characterize his leadership style and also his impact on the people that he represented?
Well, he was certainly very staunch in standing up for the interests of his people, particularly the traditionalists from KwaZulu-Natal and before that Natal. I think he had an antagonistic relationship with some members of what would have been considered to be a support base. For example, in the urban areas around Durban, there was an enormous amount of antipathy towards Inkatha, which was compensated for by their huge support among the Amakosi in the rural areas. So I guess it's going to be mixed. And, I think it's absolutely appropriate, because Buthelezi was a figure when I was a primary school boy growing up in Durban. He was a huge figure then. Well, I'm now 66, no longer primary school, obviously. And he's still a very big figure in our history, although he's passed from our immediate pages of it. And I think, as I said, he was someone who aroused a lot of emotion, a lot of devotion among his supporters, an enormous amount of antagonism from those on the other side. It's quite difficult, I think, for people now, and a lot of folk obviously watching this weren't even alive, to just remember how deeply, violently antagonistic the confrontation was between Inkatha supporters and ANC supporters, and issues around which today are very settled and everyone's quite relaxed about it, like the Zulu King, were enormously controversial. I mean, one of the reasons that Buthelezi and the IFP left the CODESA negotiations was over the status of the Zulu King. That was a matter of contestation. It was said that we will have international mediation to sort it out. Well, the international mediation didn't happen, and I think Buthelezi went to his grave believing that he'd been double-crossed by ANC negotiators and indeed de Klerk, who promised certain things would happen, which never occurred. Well, of course, this is a detail of history which is perhaps only of interest to historians, but it's actually worth reflecting that we came out of a very, very controversial and contested period when democracy was in the making here. And of course, Mangosuthu Buthelezi was front and center of that history making and of a lot of the controversies and confrontations around it.
Former leader of the DA, that's Tony Leon, giving us his personal reflections following the passing of Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi.